Part 4. Targeted. Chapter 20. A death threat against me. One day in early 2012, we were in Karachi as guests of Geo TV, and a Pakistani journalist who lived in Alaska came to see us. She had seen the New York Times video and wanted to meet me. She also wanted to take my father aside to tell him something. I noticed that she had tears in her eyes. Then she and my father walked over to the computer. They looked troubled and hurriedly shut down whatever they'd been looking at. A short while later, my father's phone rang. He took the call out of earshot and came back inside looking very gray. "What is it?" I asked. "There's something you're not telling me." He had always treated me as an equal, but I could see he was trying to decide whether to protect me from this thing or to share it with me. He sighed heavily, then showed me what he'd been looking at on the computer. He Googled my name, Malala Yousafzai, the Taliban said, should be killed. There it was, in black and white, a death threat against me. I think I had known this moment might come someday. Now here it was. I thought back to those mornings in 2009 when school first reopened, and I had to walk to school with my books hidden under my scarf. I was so nervous in those days, but I had changed since then. I was 3 years older now. I had traveled and given speeches and won awards. Here was a call for my death, an invitation from one terrorist to another saying, "Go ahead, shoot her." And I was as calm as could be. It was as if I were reading about someone else. I took another glance at the message on the screen. Then I closed the computer and never looked at those words again. The worst had happened. I had been targeted by the Taliban. Now I would get back to doing what I was meant to do. I might have been called, but my dear father was near tears. "Are you all right, Johnny?" he said. "Abba," I said, trying to reassure him, "everybody knows they will die someday. No one can stop death. It doesn't matter if it comes from a talib or from cancer." He wasn't convinced. "Maybe we should stop our campaigning for a while," he said. "Maybe we should go into hibernation for a time." My proud, fearless Pashtun father was shaken in a way I'd never seen, and I knew why. It was one thing for him to be a target of the Taliban. He had always said, "Let them kill me. I will die for what I believe in." But he had never imagined the Taliban would turn their wrath on a child, on me. I looked at my father's wretched face, and I knew that he would honor my wishes no matter what I decided. But there was no decision to make. This was my calling. Some powerful force had come to dwell inside me, something bigger and stronger than me, and it had made me fearless. Now it was up to me to give my father a dose of the courage he had always given me. "Abba," I said, "you were the one who said if we believe in something greater than our lives, then our voices will only multiply, even if we are dead. We can't stop now." He understood, but he said we should be careful about what we say and to whom we say it. On the trip back home, though, I asked myself what I would do if a Talib came to kill me. Well, I would just take my shoe and hit him. But then I thought, if you hit a Talib with your shoe, there is no difference between him and you. You must not treat others with cruelty. You must fight them with peace and dialogue. "Malala," I said to myself, just tell him what is in your heart, that you want an education for yourself, for all girls, for his sister, his daughter, for him. That's what I would do. And then I would say, "Now you can do what you want." Chapter 23. A day like any other. The second Tuesday in October started out the same as any other. I was late, as usual, because I'd slept in, as usual. I'd stayed up extra late after talking to Maniba, studying for my year-end exam in Pakistani studies. I'd already done a disappointing job on my physics exam, so I would have to get a perfect score on this exam if I was going to take the #1 spot back from Malika Noor. It was a point of pride. It was also a sibling thing. If I didn't come in first, I'd never hear the end of it from Kushaw. I gulped down a bit of fried egg and chapati with my tea and raced out the door just in time to catch the bus, crammed with other girls on their way to school. I was happy that morning, ridiculously happy. Before I left, my father had been teasing Atal, saying he could be my secretary when I became prime minister. And of course Atal said no, he would be prime minister and I would be his secretary. It seemed as if everything in my life was going well. My mother was learning to read. I was on my way to the school I loved, and Muniba and I were friends again. I told myself not to worry about Malaki Noor and instead to work hard. And I thought I should thank God for all I had. So I did. I whispered a prayer of thanks before I managed the last few minutes of studying before my exam. Oh, and God, I said, please don't forget to give me first place, since I have worked so hard. I always prayed the most during exams. Usually I did not pray on time, which means praying 5 times a day, our religious duty. But at this time of the year, my friends and I all prayed on time. I asked for help with my exams or help to come in first in the class. Our teachers always told us, though, God won't give you marks if you don't work hard. God showers us with his blessings, but he is honest as well. So I always worked hard too. Exam morning passed and I felt confident I had done well. Afterward, Muniba suggested that we stay behind and wait for the second pickup, which we did often so we could chat before going home. When the Dinah arrived, I looked around for Atal. My brother had told him to ride home with me that day. But soon I was distracted as the girls gathered around to watch our driver do a magic trick with a disappearing pebble. No matter how hard we tried, we could not figure out his secret. I forgot all about Atal as we piled into the van. We squeezed in and took our usual places, about 20 girls in all. Muniba was next to me, and the rest of my friends were across from me on the other bench. A little girl named Haina grabbed the seat next to me, the spot where my friend Shazai usually sat, forcing Shazai to sit on the bench in the middle, where we often put our backpacks. Shazai looked so unhappy, I asked Hina to move. Just as the van was about to pull away, Atal came running. The doors were shut, but he jumped onto the tailboard on the back. This was a new trick of his, riding home hanging off the tailboard. It was dangerous, and our bus driver had enough of it. Sit inside, Atal, he said, but Atal didn't budge. Sit inside with the girls, Atal Khan Yusufzai, or I won't take you, the driver said with more force this time. Atal yelled that he would rather walk home than sit with girls. He jumped down and stormed off in a huff. It was hot and sticky inside the Dinah as we bounced along Mangora's crowded rush-hour streets, and one of the girls started a song to pass the time. The air was thick with the familiar smell of diesel, bread, and kebab, mixed with the stench from the nearby stream where everyone dumped trash. We turned off the main road at the Army checkpoint as always and passed the poster that read, "Wanted Terrorists." Just after we passed the Little Giant snack factory, the road became oddly quiet and the bus slowed to a halt. I don't remember a young man stopping us and asking the driver if this was the Kushal school bus. I don't remember the other man jumping onto the tailboard and leaning into the back, where we were all sitting. I never heard him ask, "Who is Malala?" And I didn't hear the crack, crack, crack of the 3 bullets. The last thing I remember is thinking about my exam the next day. After that, everything went blank.